Hey everyone, welcome to Slurs and Stereotypes. I'm Adam, and the focus of our lecture today is on final papers and presentations. So one of our main goals for the course is to develop final papers and presentations. As we read through the articles and as we progress through the lectures for this course, I want you to be thinking about the topics and papers that are most interesting to you. Okay, and you're going to use it as a basis for your independent research in the course. As I've mentioned before, your final papers and presentations, this is my favorite part of the course because this is where I have the opportunity to better understand your individual interests and perhaps what you may do for your honors thesis or even what you may work on for a future PhD. So I think that these are really fun and also important because writing papers and preparing professional presentations is perhaps the best way to really retain your knowledge of the course material. Okay, it's very easy to sort of memorize facts and then forget them after we take quizzes, but the activity of forming your own research project, building it and piecing it together, polishing it up and presenting to others, that sort of active work is a great way to really grasp the content of this course. Okay, so today I'll talk about the criteria, the points. Also, I'll give you some ideas on how to efficiently complete your final paper and presentation. So the final paper and presentation was worth 50 points each. They're going to be very similar in structure, but they will differ in their specific requirements. Okay, so your paper and presentation is going to have a part 1, part 2, and part 3. However, so in that sense, they're going to be very similar in structure. And I'll talk you through parts 1, 2, and 3 today. Okay. The paper and presentation will be distinct, though, in that you'll submit them in distinct submission portals through B-Courses, but they'll also have slightly different requirements in that the paper will have a word length requirement and the presentation will have a time length requirement. Okay, the paper is going to be at least 3,000 words, so 3,000 words or more, and your presentation will be at least 15 minutes or longer. Okay, so these are just lower bounds. And for those of you that are really into the course material, I encourage you to work on substantive projects and I can give you constructive feedback. Okay. So the papers and presentations will be submitted on B-Courses. Okay, so importantly, make sure you submit your papers and presentations over B-Courses and not to my email. Okay, I get a crazy amount of emails and it's not an appropriate place to submit your work. Okay, so submit it through B-Courses. Also, B-Courses has tools that we use, such as Turnitin for plagiarism detection, that I can't run if you send it to my email. Okay, so it's a requirement for the course that you submit your work through B-Courses. Okay. Make sure that your paper is at least 3,000 words long and that your Turnitin similarity score is below 9%. Okay. And what you can do to check your Turnitin similarity score is feel free to submit your paper early, and then you can look on B-Courses and inspect your similarity score. Okay, so for example, try to submit your paper like 2 or 3 days early. And that way you can immediately look at your Turnitin score. And if your similarity score is a little bit too high, say it's 15%, well, now you have a few days to revise your paper and bring that similarity score down. Okay, there's a couple ways that you can work to bring down your similarity score. One is you can try to put more of the content of your paper in your own words, right? So if you're getting a high Turnitin similarity score, this means that a lot of your paper is either intentionally or unintentionally borrowed from other sources, right? Maybe you copy and pasted a long quote from Wikipedia. Maybe there's repetition from a paper that you turned in for a previous class and this paper, right? So just those um, those aspects of repetition, or those places in which the content is very similar to other content either available online or through your prior submissions, that will lead to an increased similarity score. So just make sure that you're rephrasing all the content in your own words to bring that score down. Okay, so you may have to remove quotes, you may have to rephrase certain sentences, just tool the content so that it's in your own words to the greatest extent possible. I've had students turn in papers with a 0 or 1% similarity score, and that's excellent. Okay, and anything below 9% is a good job. Okay, in terms of writing the paper in your own words. Okay, so in addition to cutting things out, like removing excessive quotes, rephrasing, another thing that you can do to bring down the score is just write more in your paper, right? Remember that the similarity score is a percentage. So if you don't have many words, well, then a few quotes may take up a lot of your paper, right? But if you're writing a longer paper, well, then that quote that you got from a different source or whatnot is gonna burn up a smaller percentage of your similarity score. Okay, so what you might want to do is, like, if you love a quote or you love how a particular thing is phrased, that's fine. Just provide more original elaboration in your own words. Okay, so either remove excess or just add additional words of your own. Do what you have to do to bring that percentage down to 9% or below. Okay. My dog's chewing on something. I'm just making sure he's not getting in trouble. Okay. And if you have questions about formatting, I've provided resources for you in the file section on B courses. So go ahead and check that out. I have one PDF I've uploaded on how to cite using APA, right? So go ahead and look at that PDF. It includes instructions as well as examples. Okay, so one like single author, multi-author, both for journals, books, and videos and audio files, and as well as in-text citation, as well as the works cited or reference section at the end. Okay, so feel free to look at that PDF in the files section, so that way you can get clear on how you can go about formatting your final paper. Okay. Excuse me. Okay. Also, there should be a document in the file section of B courses that'll give you some discussion on how to prepare your paper. Okay. We will go over the parts for the parts 1, 2, and 3, which are going to be common to your paper and presentation. Right now, I'm just going to discuss sort of what's unique to the paper and the presentation. Okay, so the paper, at least 3,000 words, similarity scored below 9%, submit it via B courses before the deadline. Okay, it's very important that you submit your work on B courses before the deadline, because I myself am under a deadline for the registrar for the university. Okay, so some people in previous semesters have asked to extend the deadline, but I can't extend the deadline because I have grades due, right? So I actually have to submit grades, right? The deadline isn't something that I personally just make up randomly for you, okay? But I am also obligated to submit grades for a deadline, and the deadline is a necessity for me to meet, because the grade submissions are tied to like financial aid and a lot of other technical things for my students, that it's absolutely imperative that I submit grades on time. Okay, so that being said, since I have to submit grades on time and I have to take time to grade about 200 student papers and presentations, it's an absolute necessity that you submit your work on time so that I can grade everything in my window and submit those grades to the registrar on time. Okay. I am saying this many, many times throughout the course, because if you submit your work, you won't be able to submit your work late. Okay, the B courses will close after the deadline, and it will not be possible to submit work after the deadline. Okay, so I'm really trying to stress this now so you can submit your work early, right? Plan to submit your work early. Don't get stuck at like 11:59 trying to upload videos and papers and then get frustrated that you can't email me your paper. Okay, instead, work on preparing your work punctually, getting it started early. Like at the very latest, you should be submitting your work the morning of the deadline, but not later than that, in case you have internet connection issues and whatnot. Okay. Um, and if you notice that you're running in any issues, like for example, say you have a hard time filming your presentation on your phone or on YouTube or whatnot, reach out to me early before the deadline and I will help you work around your issue. Okay. So for example, if for whatever reason you can't record your lecture using Zoom or YouTube, let me know early. I will hold a Zoom meeting with you at 1 in the morning if I have to. Okay. So that way we can knock out your presentation and get it submitted on time. Okay. But what won't be a good idea is if you like email me after the deadline and then try to work around some of those issues. Okay. So please be punctual with all of your work for your own best interests. Okay. All right. So papers, we've covered papers. Now presentation. Your presentation is going to be similar in structure to your paper, but you're going to present the material this time. Okay. And I think that this is very helpful. Some people have discussed with me that they found that the presentation really helped them to get clear on their ideas. Okay. Also, it's going to be a common task for you in your professional or future scholarly career. It's going to be a common activity for you to be presenting, right? And considering the nature of work, right, in the post-pandemic or in the pandemic time period, a lot of our work is online and over Zoom. So we can use this as also an opportunity to improve our presentation abilities and also just to improve how comfortable we feel presenting, right? What I don't want you to do is have to present for your very first time when it's like your dream job is on the line, right? Like imagine you graduate Berkeley, you get your dream job, but now you have to present in front of your colleagues at work. You know, maybe there's 100 colleagues, right? Maybe you've never given a presentation before. Imagine how much stress and pressure that puts on you for that first work duty, right? So let's get good. Let's at least start practicing our presentation skills now. Okay. In sort of a low stress environment, right? It's just me and your classmates. So practice your presentation with me. Work on polishing it up to the best of your ability so you feel good about your class presentation, but also don't worry if it's not perfect or if there's room for improvement, because to be honest, this is going to be a lifelong journey for all of us, right? I've been doing this for several decades and I'm still every day working on my paper writing and presentation skills. Okay. So I encourage you to join me in this lifelong practice of self-cultivation, developing our abilities to communicate effectively via writing and over in speeches, right? Over Zoom or in front of classes or in front of our colleagues at work. Okay. So practice filming a 15-minute presentation. I think that this is a good time limit, at least 15 minutes. 15 to 20 minutes, 25 minutes will be fine. Okay. Keep it under an hour because I have to grade a whole bunch of these. So do me a favor and make it manageable. Okay. But of course, I'm very interested in what you have to share. So if you want to push it a little bit past 15 minutes, I encourage you to do so. Okay. You can record this. I'm very flexible on how you record the presentation. Most importantly, I want to hear your voice. I want to hear you presenting the material. If you get a little shy in terms of the presenting your face and whatnot, don't worry about it. Okay. You can present slides, right? Or a picture or a figure as a sort of a talking point. But most importantly, I just want you to give this your best effort and at least share your share. I want you to at least share your voice with me. You can use your phone, YouTube, Vimeo, Zoom, really anything that will Loom, right? You can use any of these tools to record your presentation, okay? And you can either upload the file directly onto bCourses, but given the size of your file, just be cognizant it may take some time to upload that file. It may take an hour to upload your file, depending on the size and your internet connection. So again, just be prepared, start uploading your things early, right? A day early, okay? If you don't want to upload the file directly onto bCourses, you can also just upload the link. So for example, perhaps you want to post your lecture to YouTube. I think that would be awesome, right? Share it with the world, right? The research that you're doing here at Cal. So if you want to share a YouTube video with me, then just go ahead and share the link with me, and you can post the link on bCourses. I prefer that. I think that's ideal because it'll save you a lot of time from waiting to load the file onto bCourses directly, okay? But do whatever is convenient for you. Just make sure that if you share your link with me, a YouTube link or a Vimeo link, make sure that you set it so that I can see your video, okay? I had a student before share the link, but it was set to private, right? And it's hard for me to watch and grade your lecture if it's set to private. Okay, so just, do a sanity check after you post your video or your link or your paper. Just double check and make sure that, it posted correctly, there was no error, and also just click on the link to make sure that it's the right link and that it's accessible or viewable by me. Okay. All right. And if you have any further questions, I'm going to go through the parts 1, 2, and 3. But if you have any further questions about paper and presentation details, please check the file section, or you can reach out to me and we can talk about it over office hours. All right. So now let's go ahead and talk about the different parts of your presentation. And it's very important that your paper and presentation include these 3 parts. Okay. Essentially, the way that I'm going to grade your paper and presentation is I'm going to ask, does the paper include part 1? All right, that's going to be worth 1/3 of your grade. Okay, if you have included part 1 in your paper and presentation, boom, you're going to get a large number of points, about 1/3. Okay, then I'm going to ask, does your paper and presentation have a part 2? Okay, and if it does, and you did a good job, boom, you're going to get 1/3 of those points for your part 2. And then finally, I'm going to ask, is there a part 3 to your paper and presentation? And if there is, that's the other 1/3 of your grade right there, okay? So an easy way to ensure you maximize your points is to submit your paper and presentation on time before the deadline. Super important. But then also make sure that you have something for your parts 1, 2, and 3, okay? We can always then focus on like how good, how great is the quality of parts 1, 2, and 3, right? We can always think about how excellent those parts are, but most importantly, make sure that your paper and presentation includes those parts, okay? I'm going to tell you right now that if your paper is missing one of these parts, for example, if your paper is missing part 3, but has an excellent part 1 and 2, maybe it's like dissertation level part 1 and 2. Well, that's great in that you're going to get 100% for part 1, 100% for part 2, but then you're going to get 0% for part 3 if there's no part 3. So even if parts 1 and 2 are the best, right, you're only going to get a maximum of 2/3 of the points for this assignment. Okay, I'm stressing this right now because the important thing when you're writing papers, when you're doing assignments, both in academia and for your work, is that you're able to follow instructions and directions. Okay, imagine you have a job at a high profile company and they ask you to prepare a report that covers 3 different companies, right? Like the productivity of 3 competitor companies. Okay. Maybe you work for a car company and they want to know how Tesla, Honda, and Toyota are doing, just for example. Okay. If that's your assignment, then that's what you need to do, right? And your boss will evaluate how good of a job you did in your assignment, depending on how well you met his instructions, his or her instructions. Okay. In other words, even if you went out and you did a phenomenal report on Honda, but you only focused on Honda, and say it was the best report ever done on Honda, right? Well, you can go to your boss and say, hey, this is the best report on Honda ever done. I want an A, right? But you see, like, that's not the task. That wasn't the assignment. And that wasn't what your boss wanted from you. Okay. So I'm saying this now so that way you don't get confused and go on and just write your own paper, like about whatever you want. Okay. What I don't want is just like a single stream of consciousness style paper. Okay. What I want is a paper that accomplishes these 3 tasks. And the way your grade will be determined, the way that all grades will be determined, is the extent to which you satisfy the objectives. Okay. Again, remember that I grade all papers, I grade all work the same for all students. So that means I apply the same grading criteria to your paper and your peers' paper. And that means I can't grade everyone's paper based on these 3 criteria, but then grade just your paper on other criteria, right? That would not be fair, right? And the reason why, we are happy to be at an institution like Berkeley is because we have standards in place, right? For both fairness and both for your grade. And it's because you meet such strict standards that being at Berkeley means something and graduating from Berkeley means something, right? And it's because we want those standards, right, that this all is meaningful for us. Okay. I mean, you could have just went somewhere that had no standards, but how good would you feel about doing work of that kind and being at an institution of that kind and having a professor of that kind, right? It's not good for anybody. It's not good for you. It's not good for your peers, right? So what we want to do is hold ourselves, right, to these standards and understand that these are community standards for fairness, so everyone's graded fairly. And so we want to meet those standards and not ask for special circumstances based on you as a individual. Okay. Of course, if you have paperwork, right? If you submitted paperwork for extenuating circumstances, of course, I accept all the paperwork. Okay. But that is for a type of student, right? Like all students, you understand that all students are able to submit that paperwork and be treated equally. Okay. So depending on your situation, right, this puts you into a category and I treat everyone of that category equally, okay, and fairly based on the standards of the university and the policies of the university, okay? And that's why the grading deadlines and the criteria are established and fixed the way that they are, and they can't be changed, okay? All right. Now that I've reinforced the importance of these 3 parts, let's go ahead and walk through these 3 parts. Okay. The 3 parts of your paper and presentation are going to include the following. First, I want you to review some course content. Okay. Find one of the assigned readings, one of the assigned articles from the course, and in part 1 of your paper and your presentation, I want you to discuss that with me, right? Sort of the goal of part 1 is to demonstrate your knowledge of assigned course material, right? Show me that you actually showed up to one of the lectures and that you understood the lecture, right, about one of the articles, okay? And your job here in your paper and presentation is to give an accurate report of the main purpose, methods, and results of that article. Okay, imagine a student in class, for example, missed one of the assigned readings. Well, for your part 1, your job is to accurately report to your classmate what that reading was all about, right? The main purpose, methods, and results. Okay. Also, this will serve as a nice introduction. So for example, say you're gonna review the article by Galinsky and colleagues, right? The reappropriation of stigmatizing labels, right? Then in part one of your article, you're just gonna accurately describe the main purpose, methods, and results from that study. But then in part two, you're gonna use that article from part one as a springboard for your own original research or for your own independent research. And by original research or independent research, what I mean is I just want you to investigate, read more articles that were not assigned in class, but that are related to that article that you selected for part one. Okay. So I've already sort of helped you out with this in the supplementary file section. I've uploaded a bunch of articles on slurs and stereotypes that were not assigned. Okay, that's why they're called supplementary. So you could also just peruse through the file section and find non-assigned readings that are related to whatever article you selected for part one. So if you picked the article by Galinsky and colleagues on the reappropriation of stigmatizing labels for part one, right? And remember that focuses on the reappropriation of slurs, right? Then what you can do in your part two is search for additional articles about the reappropriation of slurs, right? Perhaps in another psychology journal, right? And there, now what you can do is you can sort of introduce the paper and presentation with something familiar, the work by Galinsky and colleagues in 2013, right? The assigned reading, the reappropriation of stigmatizing labels, but then you can also use that to introduce or to segue into a discussion of additional research articles on the reappropriation of slurs. Maybe you go on Google Scholar and you find that Galinsky maybe just published a new article on this topic, but focusing on different targets or focusing on different slurs or different participants, maybe different age groups and so on. Then what you can do is then in part two of your paper, just your job is to accurately report what's going on in those related articles, okay? So for your part two, you could say something like, in part two of my article or in part two of my presentation, I would now like to discuss related research that I found using Google Scholar. One of the articles that I found using Google Scholar was a more recent article on the reappropriation of stigmatizing labels by Galinsky and colleagues, published in some journal in 2022, okay? And the main purpose of this new article was so-and-so, okay? The methods that they used were similar to the methods used in their 2013 research. And the results that they found were so-and-so, right? Which confirms their earlier work and extends it in this novel direction, okay? In the second article in my part two, I found another article, maybe not by Galinsky, but maybe by another researcher, another psychologist, right? That also did a project on the reappropriation of slurs, okay? Maybe you find this in the journal Science, published in 2021, okay? And then you just go ahead and accurately report what's going on in those studies, okay? So again, part one, review course content, accurately report that content. In part two, find additional research articles related to part one, and then accurately report what's going on in those articles, okay? Notice so far that our goals in part one and two is to be an accurate reporter, okay? In some sense, we just want to make sure that we've got the literature right, okay? We're not yet evaluating the literature for strengths and weaknesses, limitations, or challenging it in any way, okay? For parts one and two, we're just doing our best job reporting in a factual manner, right? What these articles were showing, okay? So you can get this right or wrong, right? Like if you say that the work by Galinsky and colleagues in 2013 had 3 studies, right? Well, that's not true, right? It had 10 experiments, okay? So, right, you can be right or wrong about these facts, right? About what they showed in the figure and whatnot. So make sure that you're accurate and you understand the main purpose, methods, and results in the articles for your part 1 and for your part 2. And then in part 3, this is where you're going to offer an evaluation. Okay, so in your part 3, you're going to synthesize your knowledge about your selected topic. So for example, the reappropriation of slurs. And then you're going to talk about that collection of articles from part 1 and 2 in in um in a in an evaluative way, right? Like as a manner of assessment. Okay. So here, what I'm looking for is, whereas parts 1 and 2, it's really, you're just serving as a microphone of, or as a speaker of what other people have done. In part 3, this is where you're really talking, right? This is what you're doing or what you're thinking, right? So you might say, for example, that in your part 3, okay, throughout my presentation in parts 1 and 2, I focused on 3 research articles that were on the reappropriation of slurs. The first article was an assigned reading from class by Galinsky and colleagues on the reappropriation of stigmatizing labels, published in the journal Psychological Science in 2013. All right, the main results were this, okay? In the additional research that I found for my part 2, we saw that they extended that work, right? They replicated and extended it to show that reappropriation occurs not only for ethnic slurs, but also for gender-based and sex-based slurs as well. Or not just for ethnic slurs for these ethnic groups, but also ethnic slurs that target other ethnic groups. Okay, so you're just sort of like briefly summarizing what was found across the articles, like common results, right? Then what you can say is offer some thought, right? You can say something like, what's really interesting is we see some consistent results here, right? That across 3 different articles, we see that the power of the group, right, of the ethnic group, if that group is more or less powerful, influences the perceived offensiveness of slurs directed towards that group. Okay, and we can say that was shown first in the 2013 article, but then also replicated with other groups, right, in the articles that you've covered in your part 2. Okay, for example. Okay, so you can point that out and then offer some sort of analysis of that. Okay, why is this an important result? Does this challenge major claims from another scholar, another leading scholar? Okay, does this problematize certain philosophical positions about slurs? Does this support positions about slurs? Okay. You can also then offer suggestions for future work, right? Notice that an important goal for each article is not only to understand what's going on in the articles, but for us to ask questions about this research. Like, how could we replicate and extend it, right? How is this work compatible or incompatible with other things that we've read throughout the course, or just more generally in psychology and cognitive science, right? So here I want you to evaluate, okay? You can say something like, a lot of work in experimental psychology supports this. However, right, work from linguistics or philosophy, blah, 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 challenges this view or whatever. Okay. The most important thing for part 3 is that you engage in some original thinking, whether it's philosophical thinking or experimental style thinking. Okay. So I've provided several theoretical articles for this course. You may, for your paper, you may engage in a purely philosophical paper and presentation, or maybe you discuss my view, which was presented in the assigned reading, and then you can find some alternative views in the philosophical literature for your part 2. And then your part 3, you can argue for whatever view you think is the most convincing, right? Kroom maybe gets many things right, but doesn't consider this other phenomenon, right? So you can sort of argue that I get things right, but also I get things wrong, right? Or similarly for another researcher or scholar, okay? Or you can put 2 theorists against each other And then based on what you've read in the articles, argue for which view you find the most convincing so far. Okay, so that's how you could engage in a part 3, right? That's somewhat like philosophical. Your part 3 can also be experimental in that you can use part 3 as an opportunity to outline a future study you would like to do, right? So maybe after you've read 3 articles by Galinsky on slurs and reappropriation, maybe you feel like, okay, you know what? I really have a good grasp of what Galinsky is doing. Okay, now what I want you to do in your part 3 is you can offer like an analysis, like Galinsky did a good job of really showing this across studies, right? But a limitation is, for example, maybe they only focused on participants of a certain age, right? And maybe older participants, for example, have different views about slurs, right? Either the meaning, semantic content, or like the valence, right? Like how negative or positive they are. Okay, so you may discuss that or raise that as a limitation to the work by Galinsky and colleagues on slurs and reappropriation, right? That they focused, on participants between 20 and 40 years old, for example. Okay, an important question is, what about younger participants or older participants, right? Do we hypothesize any different results for example, significantly older participants? And perhaps something that we've read throughout the course suggests that significantly older participants have a slightly different understanding of the meaning and valence of slurs than younger participants. Well, if that's a hypothesis from another article, then we can mention that in our part 3 and use that as opportunity to discuss why conducting a future study like the one conducted by Galinsky and colleagues, but this time adjusting the participants so that way they're older rather than of the 20 to 40-year-old age range. We can explain why that might be a valuable study to do, right? And then what you could do in your part 3 is try to outline, like provide a proposal, like how would that study go about, right? And then what you could do is look at the methods section of the paper by Galinsky and colleagues and see what measures they used, how they constructed their stimulus and whatnot, right? Their stimuli, and then do your best in your part 3 to do what Galinsky and colleagues did in their articles, right? Here, I'm trying to turn you into a cognitive scientist. Like, how can you be Galinsky's collaborator on your part 3 of this paper or your presentation? Okay, and practice, right? It doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be something that is awarded a grant, right? The goal is just to practice this in the course, and then we can talk about how to improve from wherever you're at to improve and get a little bit better. Okay, and wherever you're at, some of you are going to be at different places in your writing and your presenting. I just want to take you from wherever you're at, try to move you forward and forward and forward. Okay, so these are our parts 1, 2, and 3. Okay, and in general, many papers are going to be structured in this way, where an introduction to an article, like most articles in experimental psychology don't just start with the methods or just with the results, right? But they start with an introduction, which helps to clarify the question under consideration, to contextualize the research question within the larger field of research, right? So if you read an introduction to many experimental psychology articles, it'll start with a statement like, scholars have been interested in emotions for the last 30 years or whatnot, right? Something sort of like that, right? And then it'll say something like, previous scholars, for example, have found that these brain areas are involved, or so-and-so, right? You notice, though, that even though the purpose of an article is to discuss your original research, we don't start our articles that way. We start by talking about the space or the field or the research questions more generally, what has been done already, then we plug ourselves in. Okay, it's because we're not the first psychologists or cognitive scientists, right? There's a lot of important work that was done before us, and we need to appreciate and give credit to that work, right? It's because of that previous work that we're able to start and make progress in the way that we do. Okay. And after you read through in most articles, after the introduction, right, foundational common ground work, then scientists provide a discussion of what they're doing originally, right? Like a discussion of the methods, what methods they're going to use and whatnot to interrogate or investigate their research question. Okay. And then the final part of the article, after they just discuss the results, and usually it's first provided in a very quantitative manner. After that, then is the discussion, or like a part 3, where the article, notice that most articles in experimental psychology don't just end with results and like p-values, right? Like, but rather they end with a discussion section, which aims to explain the results, right? We don't just say that, well, the result for this is 7.23 or whatever. Like, we don't care about just the quantity of a result, but we want a contextualization of what the results mean, right? So that's why in most articles in experimental psychology, we'll see a results section, which provides a concise presentation of just the results and the statistical analysis of those results. But then after that, there'll be a discussion section, okay, where what they're doing in the discussion section is discussing the results with you, right? What do these numbers mean, right? What's the implication of all this, right? And also here they're tying results, the data, into the context of existing work, okay? Relating the results to other results that have been provided, explaining the importance of these results, and also explaining the limitations of that study, okay? So part 3 of all research articles, or most research articles, is going to involve something like a synthesis of knowledge as well, okay? So what we're doing, the purpose of this structure for our paper and presentation is, I think it's a helpful way for us to get used to how we should be going about engaging in our papers and our presentations, okay? And notice that for the course, the requirements are light, in the sense that I only need you to select one article for part 1, okay? Part 2, you need to select at least one article for part 2, okay? So at minimum, you need to select at least 2 articles for your paper and presentation, okay? One article that's assigned reading, at least one article that is related but not assigned. And I say at least one because, like, you may select a book chapter that's 40 pages long, and that might be sufficient. It may include 10 or 20 studies, right? On the other hand, if you select articles from science for your independent research, you may have to include 2 or 4 related articles, just because of the content that you're discussing in your part 2 is going to be more consolidated if you're picking articles from science, okay? But what I'm trying to say here is the requirements for the paper presentation in this course are rather light, but the principle is something that you can reiterate continuously to develop a longer, more substantive project, right? So what you could do, right, is after you've reviewed 2 articles on the reappropriation of slurs, after you feel comfortable with the amount of work for this assignment, you can push it so that way your presentation is now longer, right? So what you may do, perhaps on your own time after the course is over, is you may want to try to develop a 30-minute presentation or a 6,000 word article, right? And then what you would do is just essentially find more related articles on Google Scholar, include that into your literature review, right? And at some point, if you cover like 20, 30 articles on a focused topic, like the reappropriation of slurs, that could be a significant literature review, right? And you can talk to me about if it's appropriate to submit that to an undergrad, grad, or professional journal for publication, right? If you do a substantive review of all the literature on slurs and reappropriation, right? And then you provide a careful analysis of that at the end of your literature review. This is something that we could submit as a literature review for publication. And notice that all we're doing in that literature review is the steps we're taking are already provided here. Okay. Read Galinsky's 2013 article, go read all the other articles that are relevant, right? Then synthesize your knowledge about that, summarize the main themes, results, point out problem cases and limitations, and then boom, right? We have a substantive paper that we can present at a conference or publish at a journal of some level, okay? All right, now I'm just gonna go ahead and talk through each part in a little bit more detail, just so we're all super clear, okay? So for part one of your final paper and presentation, I want you to review course content, okay? So select assigned content from the course to review and discuss in the first part of your paper. Optional papers to select from are available in the primary readings folder on B courses, okay? So for your part one, select an article from the primary readings folder on B courses. The purpose of part one is to demonstrate your mastery of material covered in this course, okay, by providing an accurate report about some specific content covered in the course. The purpose of part one is also to use an assigned article as a springboard for further individual research on your selected topic, okay? Avoid selecting articles unrelated to cognitive science or articles that are disconnected from each other. Okay, I don't want this to be 3 mini presentations in one presentation time slot. I want this to be one presentation. So that means there needs to be a single coherent theme, right? So you may title your presentation, The Reappropriation of Slurs. And that means that's the coherent theme that's tying together all the parts of your paper, okay? What we don't want to do, right, what you don't see in an article on a single topic is like 3 distinct things going on, right? Where like the first part of my paper is about the reappropriation of slurs, and the second part is about, you know, ice cream, and then the first part is about, you know, online memes or something, right? It doesn't make sense why we would do that. And if you hear a presentation where someone is talking about 3 disconnected things, clearly it doesn't come across as a thoughtful single presentation or coherent presentation, okay? So always do a sanity check. Like as you start your research, as you start collecting articles on Google Scholar, you may end up with a nice handful of interesting articles. But upon further inspection, you may realize that, you know what, all those articles don't fit well together, right? Maybe 2 of the articles, although you're interested in all the articles, maybe 2 of the articles out of the 5 don't fit well. So you may have to remove those unrelated, disconnected articles and just focus on those which help paint a single coherent picture, story, research project, okay? This is something that, again, will become easier with practice, okay? Like, what's the focus of these articles? You have to really understand what each article is focusing on, making sure that the articles you select share a common or at least related connected focus, okay? For example, maybe you like the article by Galinsky and colleagues that was published in 2013, entitled The Reappropriation of Stigmatizing Labels, right, that we read for this course. Since this was assigned reading, you can select this article from the assigned readings and discuss the purpose, methods, and results from this article in part 1 of your paper. If you select a philosophical paper instead, make sure to also discuss the main concepts and arguments presented in that paper, okay? So in philosophy, they're going to utilize a variety of concepts, some which may not be used widely in empirical articles. Okay, so if you're talking about, like epiphenomenalism, something that may not be well known to your audience, just go ahead and explain what you mean by that. Okay, like what do philosophers mean by epiphenomenalism or whatnot? Or what do they mean by pure expressivism or co-referentialism and so on? Okay, and you can like clarify the concepts in those philosophical articles. And then if you're covering philosophical papers, make sure that you're discussing like the arguments that are presented in favor of the different views. Okay, like Kroom believes this and his arguments are so and so. However, another scholar believes something different and they argue this and so. Okay. All right, so for part 2 of your paper, this focuses on individual research on related content that's related to the article you selected from part 1. So for part 2, use Google Scholar to search for content that is related to the content you discussed in part 1 of your paper. The purpose of part 2 is to demonstrate your ability to conduct independent research on a focused topic. So, what other research exists in the literature that is related to the topic you selected in part 1? What other work exists on the reappropriation of stigmatizing labels or slurs? The purpose of part 2 is also to identify important connections across distinct articles. Okay, this is also very important. Okay, what is the common thread or theme that unites these distinct articles? So for example, if you reviewed Galinsky and colleagues' 2013 article, The Reappropriation of Stigmatizing Labels, in part 1 of your paper, you can search for related articles to discuss in part 2 of your paper. In part 2, discuss the main purpose, methods, and results from the additional related articles that you selected from your independent research. Okay, and you want to demonstrate your mastery of this additional material by providing an accurate report about the content covered in your independent research. Okay, so if you want to find other related articles, right? So if you select this article by Galinsky and colleagues and you want to find other related articles, you can go on Google Scholar and just type in the name of the article here. Okay, and if you're not getting great results by just typing the name of the article there, you can use quotation marks, and that'll make sure that what's returned to you is exactly this. Okay. If you don't use quotation marks, sometimes you'll just get results where like maybe reappropriation is in the title, but not all the words, like the reappropriation of stigmatizing labels. Okay. So if you want that full thing, the reappropriation of stigmatizing labels, use quotation marks around your search item. Okay. And here we see that when we search for this, right, that boom, we get our 2013 article as the first result. Okay. But we also get other articles that are related to reappropriation and slurs. Okay. So for example, you may pick as an article for your part 2, this article right here by Whitson and colleagues, Navigating Stigma and Group Conflict, Group Identification as a Cause and Consequence of Self-Labeling. Okay, so you might select this article for your part 2, and then your goal for part 2 will be to explain, accurately report what's the purpose, methods, and results from that article. Okay, excuse me. All right, and here I'm just going to offer you some tips to help you with your search. Okay, tips for using Google Scholar. One thing you can do if you want to find articles that are related to our part 1 article, right, the Galinsky article, for example, one thing you can do is when you see this target article appear as the first result in your Google search, notice that under the article, it says cited by 184. What that means is that 184 other articles, more recent articles, cite this article, okay? And what that means is that these other articles must be related to this research in some way or another, okay? It may not be identical, like there may be some articles here that just mention this article in passing, okay? However, out of the 184 articles, it's very likely that a subset of those articles are going to be very similar, right, in purpose, methods, and results as this article. So what you can do if you want to find additional related research, click on Cited By, and you'll get a nice list of articles that cite this article. And you'll get about 184 here, okay? And as you look at through the 184, you're going to have to select, right? They're not all going to be perfect or ideal. But as you search through these, right, you're going to narrow your search and be searching through relevant articles on slurs and reappropriation. And then your goal here is just to find a few to discuss for your part 2. Okay. All right. So one thing we notice is if you click on this, cited by 184, you'll notice that this article also cites this article. So this article by Whitson and colleagues, 2017, you can find this as a related article either through a keyword search, like what we did here, but also by clicking on cited by. Okay, so those are just 2 alternative ways for you to start searching for related content. Okay, another thing that you can do is think about the major figures that are working on these topics, right? Like Galinsky's one of the major figures, right? There's certain scholars that like we work a lot on these topics, okay? So what you can also do is just see if we have a personal website or a web page, or check our academia or ResearchGate and see if we have any other publications that may be of interest, okay? And these are just going to be ways for you to get your hands on related articles, okay, for whatever topic you're interested in. All right. So this was the 3rd tip, look up other articles published by the same authors, right? So if you're really into the work by Galinsky, Wang, Anisich, and Whitson, then go ahead and check out these authors, right? Both on Google Scholar, on their scholarly social media, and personal web pages. They may have some articles that are accessible for you, okay? This is also a way that you can get around a paywall. Another important thing that I wanted to mention, sometimes you won't have access to these articles because they're behind a paywall, right? You have to pay like a fee to download the articles, but let's not do that just yet. I don't want you spending your money, okay? What you can do though is access a lot of these articles for free, okay? First, notice that on the right-hand side, many of these results have a PDF section to the right. So notice here it says PDF and it's connected to academia. This means you can get a free copy of this article from academia, okay? If you just click on this article right here, it'll take you to the official website for psychological science, and you won't have access to this article. You won't be able to download it from psychological science, okay? Because you have to be a paid subscriber to access articles from psychological science. However, if you look through these other versions, like here we see there's 12 versions, right? This is one of those versions. Oftentimes, either directly on the right-hand side or by exploring the alternative versions, you can find a free copy of the article, okay? And it may not be typeset in the format as it appears in the final journal publication, right? It might not be pretty with all the page numbers and the DOI and whatnot, but nonetheless, you may be able to get your hands on like a Word copy or like a pre-publication draft, okay? And for the sake of just getting our hands on articles, that'll be sufficient for our purposes, okay? So use this as a technique to get free copies of scholarly research, okay? Look for PDFs on the right-hand side and Here we're lucky to find that a lot of these are provided, but there may be cases where you don't see a PDF on the right, but if you explore all versions, you may get lucky and find another way to get your hands on that article. Okay. All right, so regardless of how you find your articles, right, using Google Scholar with keywords, cited by, or looking up the authors on Google Scholar, regardless of how you find your additional articles, make sure that all the articles you select for part 2 are related to the article you discussed in part 1. Okay, whatever articles you get from Google Scholar during your independent research, ask yourself for each article, how is this related to the article I picked for part 1? How does this article, for example, Navigating Stigma and Group Conflict, relate to the Galinsky and colleagues 2013 article, The Reappropriation of Stigmatizing Labels? Okay, you need to be able to answer that question, how they're related. And here we see that they're very clearly related because this article also presents experiments, 3 experiments, where they evaluate slurs or derogatory group labels and self-labeling or reappropriation. Okay, so we see that these two, right, the assigned article from 2013 and this article, which I picked for my independent research, that they're very much related to each other. They even have the same co-authors. Okay, so perfect. We can see that these 2 articles are a good fit to be components of a unifying, coherent paper and presentation. Okay. All right. And then your goal for part 2, right? If I selected this article for my part 2 article, is I would just carefully explain the purpose, methods, and results of this article. And here, like, students have asked, how many articles should I include in my part 2, right? And here, like I mentioned earlier in the lecture today, it's going to be somewhat dependent, right, on the type of articles you select, right? Whether you're picking very brief articles from science or you're picking substantive book chapters or books, right? Depends on what you're selecting. Also, it's going to be dependent on the time that you've allocated for part 2 in your presentation. Okay, so for example, given that the presentation is 15 minutes, you may allocate 5 minutes to each section, right? 5 minutes to review course content, 5 minutes to review related research from Google Scholar, and 5 minutes for your synthesis. Okay, well, now we have a framework or structure in which we can more appropriately answer that question, right? Like, how many articles should you select for part 2? Well, if you only discuss one article and it takes you 2.5 minutes, well, you have 2.5 minutes left to cover. So you need to select at least another article, right? On the other hand, if you want to, say, do a 20-minute presentation and you want to do 5 minutes for part 1, 5 minutes for part 3, but 10 minutes for part 2, right? Well, then now you just need to cover enough material that you have 10 minutes of presentation for your part 2. Okay, and what you can do is start by assessing how long it takes you to cover one article. Okay, and then using that as a benchmark, or as a ruler for how many additional articles you need to include to meet your time requirements. Okay, and your part 1, since you're only reviewing one article, you may cover it rather quickly. So maybe you'll devote 3 minutes to part 1, right? 3 minutes to part 3, right? And then make your part 2 more substantive. Okay, so just think, based on the articles you're selecting and the time requirement, what's suitable or reasonable for you to accomplish your task. Okay, and remember that our tasks, we have 3 primary tasks here. Okay, parts 1, 2, and part 3, such that it's unified into one coherent paper or presentation. Okay. All right. Now, finally, I just want to review part 3 with you. Okay, what goes into your part 3? Well, the purpose of part 3 is to synthesize your knowledge about your selected topic. At this point, you have now provided an accurate report about some specific content covered in the course in part 1. And you've also provided an accurate report of related content that you found from your independent research in part 2. Notice that parts 1 and 2 of your paper focused on providing accurate reports about a specific topic. For example, what the literature has to say about slur reappropriation. By reading the assigned article in the course and finding additional related articles in your independent research, you have become a mini expert on your selected topic. Awesome. Time to share what you have learned by providing a synthesis and evaluation of your topic for your audience. We have all started from a common place of origin, a common core of assigned readings, but we have now each branched off to become specialists in our selected area of expertise. And this is one of the really awesome things about cognitive science, okay, is that we can become experts in different areas and also even in different approaches on similar areas. Okay, so let's come back together now and share what we have learned from our independent research with our peers. In part 3, avoid simply restating points that you already stated in parts 1 and 2. Okay, so in part 3, try to avoid any idle repetition. Instead, go beyond what was already stated in parts 1 and 2 to offer an insight about the material covered in parts 1 and 2. Okay, so here you want to provide a constructive synthesis or evaluation, which takes information from parts 1 and 2 and offers something novel, insightful from this. Okay, so for part 3, we're not just repeating what was said in parts 1 and 2, but rather we're using what was done in parts 1 and 2 to say something new, novel, insightful. Okay. What I like to say is that part 3 is not reducible to parts 1 and 2, but part 3 is not possible without parts 1 and 2. Okay, so part 3 is not just 1 and 2, but it's also not possible without parts 1 and 2. Okay, you have to explain what COGSCI did in 2013, as well as what they did in 2017, to be able to provide a synthesis and evaluation of what that research group did overall throughout their work in 2013, 2017, and elsewhere. Okay. So for example, whereas in part 1, you may report the main purpose, methods, and results from COGSCI and colleagues' 2013 article on reappropriation. And in part 2, you may report the main purpose, methods, and results from Whitson and colleagues' 2017 article on reappropriation. In part 3, you would want to offer an original evaluation of this work by COGSCI and colleagues, or provide original suggestions for future work. Okay, based on what they did in the articles that you reviewed, what would be a reasonable and productive future project or next project? Consider questions such as these for your discussion section for your part 3. Okay, what are the common themes uniting the distinct articles in parts 1 and 2? What was the most salient point or finding across all articles? Given the collection of articles you have read, what are some limitations of this body of work? What is the theoretical or practical value of this work? How might you extend this kind of research in a new way? And what would be really cool about that? In part 3 of your paper, I want to see you doing something thoughtful and careful with the articles you have read. I want to see you really thinking thoroughly about this material, exploring reasonable connections, and reflecting on the value of our work as cognitive scientists. Right? Oftentimes in the discussion section, we try to articulate what's useful or beneficial about our work, either theoretically or practically, right? You might suggest that, for example, I might say my articles contributes to the literature by improving our theoretical model, right? Like One way to contribute to the literature is by offering a theoretical or an academic type of contribution. Okay. But not all contributions have to be articulated in that way. Other contributions are more practical, right? Maybe you don't want to talk about, maybe your point isn't that we've now developed a more nuanced analysis or model of slurs, but maybe uh, your the benefit of your work is that we've discovered the best ways of mitigating racial harm and bias for students in the university. Okay, so you see, like, the value of our research can be practical and social, or it can be purely theoretical, or it can be both. Okay, and your goal for part 3 is just to ask yourself, like, why is my work important? You know, theoretically, how does my work contribute to the field? How does it address questions that maybe other theories or models don't address? Okay, but also, what's practically useful about this, right? Can educators use this? Can this be of benefit to social workers? Like, who can use this for some sort of benefit? Can legal scholars benefit from this type of research, right? Just trying to connect the value part of our work as cognitive scientists. This is also very important because it'll help emphasize the value of your work when your work is being reviewed for publication or for a conference, right? Oftentimes after we read a study, there's a lot of studies that get submitted. Ultimately, we ask, like, what's good about this? Like, why is this valuable, right? Is it valuable, right? And if you've done a good job of explaining to the audience, whether it's the casual reader or to a peer reviewer, it's going to make it easier for you to get your paper accepted. Okay, if you're unclear about the value of your own work, then you can assume that your readers and your peer reviewers are going to be unclear about the value of publishing that work. Okay, so really try to articulate why your work is important, not just your results, because this will help you get your work published and help society understand the value of work. And who knows, you may want to apply for a grant for external funding, and your ability to articulate the practical value of your work could make or break your ability to be awarded a grant, right, to support yourself. Okay. All right. So finally, I just want to say that part 3 of the paper may be challenging for many, right? Because it's really asking of you to do the most original work, right? In terms of evaluation, assessment, and proposing future studies. Okay, so part 3 may be challenging, and you may not feel completely confident that you did a great job, but that's okay. Okay, our goal here in college is to build skills and improve ourselves, right? From class to class, we should be improving our research skills, our reading skills, our presentation skills. So that way, when we get our jobs and we get into graduate school, right, we'll be better prepared for the increasingly difficult tasks that are imposed on us. Okay, so don't worry about this being difficult. We're all going to be a little bit nervous as we prepare our papers and our presentations for our peers and colleagues. Okay, that's okay. Okay. We are working on developing our skills now. Okay. I'm not evaluating you as like a professional. I just want to see you doing your best effort following the instructions. Okay. The important goal as scholars and scientists is not to simply read a bunch of unrelated articles, right? But rather to identify connections in what we read and systematize how we think. Okay. So as we continue on our journey as cognitive scientists, as we are getting further away from high school level work and thinking, where our goal is primarily to memorize and answer quiz questions correctly, like tests, right? As we move away from that and we move closer towards graduate school level work, where the emphasis is now on us coming up with original research projects, executing those projects and publishing our results, right? as we move in our journey, right, from quizzes to projects, right, I just want you to be working on systematizing your thinking. Okay. Ask yourself not just what is important to memorize, right? Because that could be a little bit random and idiosyncratic, but rather, how do I connect things together, right? Not just memorizing a disconnected collection of facts, but rather, how do I apply a method of reading articles, thinking about this research, and then using that to produce new research, okay? So we're trying to continuously improve our ability to identify connections in what we read and systematize how we think. And that's really the most important thing in becoming a scientist, and not just memorizing a bunch of facts. Okay. Although, as I've expressed, we want to make sure that we get our facts right, so that way we can feel confident about our reading comprehension skills. Okay. So this doesn't mean like who cares about facts, right? But just that once we get facts, that's not, our job is not done, right? But in some sense, we're just getting started. And our work, our real work, is how do we use those facts and findings in previous work to do something new ourselves, so that way we can contribute to the literature, so that way we can leave an original mark in the field. Yeah. And I think that this is really, at least for me, I think that this is really awesome and meaningful, right? That we can, it's hard to be new, right? These days, like, everyone's got a fancy car, right? Like everyone has common things, clothes, right? All these things are mass produced. But one thing that is original and can be a unique contribution, the way that you can leave a unique mark on the world, is by doing some original science, right? And that doesn't mean like reinventing everything and doing something completely, right, out of nowhere, right? But rather what it means is just understanding the step-by-step process of science, understanding the history of work in the field, and then you replicating and extending it in a novel way. Right? And if you can replicate and extend research in one novel way, and then do it again, and then do it one more time, right? Now we're engaged in real work, real scientific work, okay? What I think is really awesome and incredibly rewarding, okay? So I also really enjoy this part of the course because I like to see you develop as students, not just earning easy A's on the quizzes, but also leaving the course with a polished piece of work of your own, okay, that you can use for conference presentations and future publications, okay? So by carefully reading a few selected articles on specific topics, such as reappropriation, you're working to develop your ability to derive some important takeaway points for your audience, which I think is a very practical skill for any career. Okay, almost any career, you're going to have to read things and then derive the most important essential takeaway points, whether you're in business, whether you're in academia or whatnot. Okay. All right, so last two slides. So here, what I want to do on this slide is just offer you a suggestion for how to go about working on your paper. And this is just how I would do it. And you can feel free to take what's useful and ditch what's not useful for you, okay? So this is what I would do, how I would go about preparing my paper, okay, which may be helpful for you to follow. First, I'd find an article that I like from the options provided. Like the Galinsky and colleagues article is pretty cool. So I might pick that article for my part 1 article. I then prepare a note card that is devoted to this article by Galinsky and colleagues 2013. Okay, so the reappropriation of stigmatizing labels, I have one note card that's devoted to that article. Okay, and then on that note card, I'm going to be very clear and identify the main purpose. I might even write like purpose, methods, results, and try to fill that in on the note card. Okay, so identify the main purpose, methods, and results in a clear way. Okay, and I think the note card is useful because it only has a limited amount of space, so you have to be very clear and concise on what the purpose is, right? And this will prevent you from sort of just like copying, pasting a whole paragraph, which keeps you at a somewhat unclear level. If you really know what's going on in the article, you should be able to write it down in a sentence or two. Okay. All right. So after you summarize the main purpose, methods, and results for your part one article on one note card or two note cards, then, excuse me, repeat the same note card process for the additional related articles that you found using Google Scholar. Okay. So for example, I might find two more articles on Google Scholar on slurs and reappropriation, and I might therefore have two additional note cards. One note card for the first article for part two, and another note card for the second article for my part two. Okay. And methodologically, I'm just doing the same thing on those two note cards. My two note cards for part two articles are similarly just going to state the main purpose, methods, and results for that article. Okay, with each article having its own note card. Okay, so sweet. Now I've got a few note cards, and on each note card, a nice concise summary of the purpose, methods, and results. Okay, and if I need more articles, I just add more note cards. But now I'm ready to go, right? I'm ready to use these note cards to get a quick reminder of what the articles are about, the main purpose, methods, and results. But then I can just sort of talk about it more conversationally from my own memory, like how I do every lecture. Like there's slides that make sure that I don't veer off on completely unrelated content, but the slides I'm just using as an anchor or as a cue, as a reminder. And then the lectures are all just, I'm just talking to you, okay? Use, especially for your presentation, I would recommend this. It comes off as a much more receptive, a much more, it's easier to pay attention to your presentation if you talk more conversationally. Okay, so I encourage you to not read word for word from your note cards like this or from your slides like this, but rather just, take a moment to look at the slide and then just talk to me from there. Okay. All right. After selecting my articles and preparing note cards for my part two articles, eventually I should be left with note cards for all my articles, both part one and part two articles. Do a sanity check with your note cards. Make sure that they all fall under the same theme or topic and that you're still consistent with each other. Okay. You may notice as you are getting more clear and concise in your note cards that, like this fourth article doesn't fit. Let me throw that out and just focus on this. Okay. You just want to have a clear, focused presentation, not one that just has a bunch of extra studies. Okay. So do a sanity check and just make sure that all your note cards are still consistent with each other in terms of what they're showing or whatnot. Okay, that they're all about the reappropriation of slurs, for example. Okay, now that you've ensured that all your note cards go together and that they could all fall within a single theme or topic, then what I would do is just sort of take a moment, right? Like take a break. Sometimes I like to go for a jog or take a nap or take a shower, just sort of like reset mentally. And then I would take the note cards and either go to the coffee shop or go sit under a tree. And I like to go, when possible, weather permitting, go sit under a nice tree, right? And just me with my note cards, right? Like leave the phone at home, just sort of like detach yourself from any distractions and give yourself like 2 hours at the park where it's just you and your note cards. Okay. And maybe you can bring an additional note card or scratch paper and just engage with your own notes, right? Sit at the park with your note cards and ask yourself, right? Maybe drink some coffee, get in the zone, and just ask yourself questions from the previous slide. For example, what are the strengths and limitations of this work? Look at your note cards and ask yourself, okay, what is the value of this work? How can I replicate and extend this work, and so on? Okay. I think it's just helpful to, because what we're trying to do for part 3 is stop copying and pasting from online and stop relying on what other people are saying and everything else. We're trying to really just focus on what we think, right? What our assessment is and what our original thoughts are. Okay, I think the best way to do this is to just get away from technology that can distract you and which will allow you to settle into your comfort zone of just seeing what other people say, right? Go to the park and just engage with your notes and think as best as you can and try to generate from your own mind um, as much part 3 content as you can, right? You should be able to, with your note cards, you should be able to write a research proposal, for example, at the park, right? With just your note cards, sit down and think about your part 3. Based on this work that I've mastered so far, how can I replicate and extend this study? And what would that look like? Okay. And try your best to knock that out at the park or, you know, on your own. This part 3, I think it's going to come out the best the more you engage with this in your own way. Okay. In your own focused time away from other distractions and crutches or forms of support. Okay. And just remember, you don't have to complete your doctoral dissertation in this course. Just, I want you to just try to come up with a few clear and thoughtful ideas to conclude your paper. Okay. So you don't have to have like a full, uh, you know, substantive assessment, but see if you can come up with a few points. Okay. Like how you might extend this research or how it's valuable and whatnot. Okay. The point again is just to practice improving our papers and presentations, not completing a doctoral dissertation today. Okay. And importantly, I look forward to your papers and presentations. Nothing makes my day like an excellent student presentation. If you're feeling great about your work and want to learn more about submitting your work to conferences and journals, please let me know, and I will be happy to discuss these opportunities with you. I published my first paper as an undergraduate, and I would love for my students to publish their first papers as undergraduates as well. Okay, so let's do this. Yeah, reach out to me and we'll get this going. Okay. I've also, I'm launching a new journal and which is going to have a section devoted to undergraduates and a section devoted to graduate students, as well as a professional section. So there's going to be plenty of publication opportunities for you. Okay, so please feel free to reach out over Zoom. Also, come visit me during office hours on campus once we make it onto campus next month. Okay. All right, and just finally a summary. I kind of covered a bit today. I just want to summarize for you the main points from our lecture today. Okay, the lecture today is about final papers and presentations. Each one is worth 50 points. Okay, they're similar in structure. They have parts 1, 2, and 3, but they differ in specific requirements. That paper has a word length requirement of at least 3,000 words, whereas the presentation has a time length requirement of at least 15 minutes. Okay, because I have a grade submission deadline and I will not submit any grades late, right? That means that you also have a fixed deadline, so you can't submit your work late either. If you anticipate any issues with your grade, with your the submission of your final work, one thing you can do is, was I going to say, reach out to the registrar or the university. Reach out before the deadline to see if you can do a change of grade or pass fail option or change it to an incomplete, right? So what I'm saying is if you are worried about the deadline for whatever reason, like you have a family thing that comes up, okay, just I want you to, as quickly as possible, as soon as you anticipate that issue, reach out to the registrar or reach out to myself, okay, and see what we can do, because moving the deadline is not going to be an option. Okay, so change of grade, incomplete, these are possibilities, but moving the deadline further back is not, because of my own deadline. Okay. Again, submit all your work earlier rather than later, at least a day before the deadline, so that way you have enough time to upload files onto B courses and to check your Turnitin similarity score, so you have enough time to bring that score down if you need to. Okay. If you're having any issues recording your presentation, reach out to me in advance, well before the deadline, and I will help you. I'll do whatever it takes to help you record your presentation before the deadline. Okay. Finally, if you have any remaining questions about the final paper and presentation, go ahead and check the respective sections on B courses. The sections will be opened today, where you'll have information for your final paper, you'll have information for your final presentation, along with grading criteria. And in that section of B courses will also be where you submit your final paper and presentation. Okay, so it's not open yet, but I'll open the portals up for you after I post this lecture today. Okay, so go ahead and just double check B courses, the relevant portals, as well as the file section for any additional information you need about the final paper and presentation. I have it all out there for you. Okay. And then finally, don't forget the 3 parts of your presentation and your paper, since I'm going to grade based on whether you have satisfied these 3 parts. Okay. Part 1, make sure that you review course content. Okay. Part 2, make sure you conduct some individual research that's related to the article you selected for part 1. Okay. And then I want you to review the content of those articles from your independent research. Okay. And then part 3, take the articles from your part 1 and part 2, and then synthesize your knowledge about those articles and your selected topic, and offer an evaluation of the strengths and limitations of that work. You can also offer suggestions for future work. Okay, and if you're preparing a philosophical paper, make sure that you clarify concepts, you discuss arguments that are presented for varying positions, right? Like for and against a position, and then offer your own view of which position is ultimately the strongest or the best argued position. Okay. Oh, I hope you enjoyed this lecture today and that it was useful for you in preparing your final papers and presentations. I look forward to your final papers and presentations. Thank you for your attention today, and I hope you have a great day. I look forward to seeing you tomorrow for our next lecture.